What have you seen in your data on the family structure driving weak and strong men, and let's call it weak and strong relationships with one's masculinity?
What's really interesting is that we often frame girls as being the vulnerable gender, right? We often frame conversations around like protecting our children, like protecting our girls. We're not protective of boys. And what we find in the data that I find really important for us to talk about as a society is that in many ways, boys are actually more vulnerable than girls. When you look at, for example, certain areas that have less resources, boys and girls are hurt by, we see the data in the United States, how your zip code defines, so many other things. But for boys, it is worse. And girls will be able to adapt and fare better in low resource environments than boys are. So boys are actually really vulnerable. We need to be just as curious about the way that we can protect boys as we are interested in protecting girls. And by the way, when we protect boys, it protects girls. Because to your point, most of the problems that women have are because of men. So it's like, let's just, men are the first victims of patriarchy.
Welcome back to Yang Speaks, the future of. This is your host, the future of, Zach Rauman. Thank you for taking the time to tune in. Today, we have an episode that I'm particularly passionate about. Today, we have Liz Plank on to talk about the future of masculinity, which is something different than the topics we've been talking about, but in my opinion, imperative to where we're going as a society. And specifically, what Liz talks about is how we reevaluate our relationship, both men and women, our relationship with masculinity, how we understand that. I'm particularly very, very excited about it. But a few things first before we dive in, a couple housekeeping things. Number one, the plan was to do a 12-week series, limited series on the future of, and I have good news based on the feedback I'm getting. We're gonna extend this. So the future of is not going anywhere. I know some of you are very worried. We're gonna keep it going probably through the end of June. The plan is to the end of June, another few weeks. And then lots of exciting stuff coming down the pike for Yang Speaks. So thank you all for tuning in. We will continue to deliver great content for you to listen to. Second thing is Monday, we're celebrating our 100th episode. We're doing a mailbag. So if you go on Instagram even, but Twitter mainly, but either of those, I'm going to check and Andrew will check and use the hashtag AskYangSpeaks, one word, hashtag AskYangSpeaks. Let us know your questions. We're going to get to as many as we can. So those are our housekeeping items. And now I want to set up this episode. Liz Plank, author, journalist, influencer, and a very, very hardcore feminist. For this episode in particular, my dad was really involved in men's ministry with our church growing up. So I'm extremely passionate about this. I'm extremely passionate about how you set up a society that creates strong men. And I grew up thinking gender and our relationship with masculinity was a simple thing. And the older I get, the more I realize how complicated it is. And particularly for men, how complicated our own relationships are with what it means to be a man. And Liz, where I've always respected Liz and agreed with Liz on, is that she believes we need to focus more on men because strong men treat women well. And weak men harm women or don't appreciate and don't respect them. And we need a society that creates and values strong men, and values men and encourages men to respect women. And that's what I'm excited about, how we do that, because I believe it's essential. I think Tom Brokaw said this at an event I once went to, said that the US has only tapped into half of the country's potential because it's been just led by men for decades and decades. So I'm excited where this future is going, but men have a role to play. We have a long way to go as a society, and I'm excited, and I was really excited to learn from Liz and talk to Liz about what this means. So tune in, guys. This went on a ramble, but this episode is something I'm very passionate about. The Future of Masculinity. Liz Plank joins right now on Yang Speaks. All right, it is my joy right now to talk about the future of masculinity with someone I got to know on the presidential trail who comes at the same problem and somewhat the same solution, but a completely different way. It's my absolute honor to welcome now recurring guest on Yang Speaks, journalist, author, producer, influencer. What else are you? You're just a general badass. Liz Plank, welcome to Yang Speaks.
Thank you so much. Am I a friend of the pod? Are we is that...
You're a friend of the pod now.
I'm a friend. Oh my God, that's major. That's major. I feel honored that we made it this far.
So when we met, I had no idea who you were. You were kind of a big deal, but I didn't know. We did so many interviews, I had no clue. And then I remember I posted online a photo of you and Andrew, a quick video of you guys talking. And I had 3 or 4 friends of mine be like, "Are you with Liz Plank right now?" And I was like, if that's Liz Plank, then I guess I am. And now, so I've gotten to know you, and you are very, very vocal and a very, very passionate feminist, but you hit it differently, almost controversially in some circles. And you focus on female empowerment. You focus on all of the things that a traditional quote unquote feminist is talking about, but you also focus on men and empowering. Let's say the concept of weak men is what I'm passionate about. I think a lot of the problems that we're looking at in terms of what is hurting women the most, I think weak men are at the top of the list. And I'm very, very passionate about how societies can create weak men. How do we get there? So I want to dive into all of this, but let's start a little bit, because you've been in a lot of different types of production. Not everything you've done has been geared in this topic, but you found your way there. So tell me a little about your background and how you wrote this book for love of men, which is a feminist take on how we need to basically get men to be better at not being so weak. And so let's tell me a little about your background, how you got into this, Liz.
Yeah. So my background is I was enrolled for a master's in social work in Montreal. I thought that was, going to be my path. And then I woke up the morning of my program and I was like, I don't think this is what I meant to do. And so I ended up
Day one?
Yes, and I canceled. I lost a couple $100, but they did refund me. And my mother was mortified. But I ended up doing a master's in policy work, right? So I really thought. And I was working with people with disabilities at the time at a community center and if you watch Crip Camp, at a camp that's very similar to Crip Camp. And what I found really frustrating, just in general, also regarding women, but regarding all marginalized sort of communities, is that in my day-to-day job, I, could do as much. There's only so much I could do as a community counselor. And I felt like as a social worker, so I wanted to go into policy to maybe work in government, or I don't even know. I literally just was like, okay, this makes sense. I started writing when I was doing my master's in London, and I started this campaign around female boxers and skirts, and it's a whole thing. And that's how I got my first article published. And then I just started writing, and I was like, oh, wait a minute. Wow, media is a whole beast, and I can really write about things and not just have a professor put it in his recycling bin at the end of the day, but actually, find my tribe and find people to talk about these things with and actually impact change. So I ended up, and I was, really specializing in women's studies and gender, particularly, and again, gender equals women in most of our brains, when actually what started happening as I was, and I was a reporter at Vox, at Mike. That's how we came to know each other. I was reporting on, politics and on the campaign trail. And just, I was just noticing that it's great to talk about these things with women, and I would find myself in rooms filled with women and having incredible conversations about freedom and liberty. But then I'd be like, wait a minute, like, no wonder we haven't really moved the needle in terms of gender equality and feminism. I think enough if half of us are missing, right? And so as I started doing research for this book, For the Love of Men, first of all,
that
I started
not plugging at all.
Not plugging at all. I don't know. It's like
no,
it's
good.
Here.
It's good.
It's hiding all of the mess in my room. Let's be honest. We might do a reveal at the end.
We might do a reveal.
We will not. So two things happened. I started talking to men about feminism and and talking to men about gender, and realizing, oh my God, there is so much happening with men in relationship with their gender, just like there is with women in their gender. Women have all kinds of stories, experiences, right? Ideals, models that were pushed on them, rethinking the way that they are as women in the world, right? Women have been thinking about this for, so long. And men, I realized I was the first person to ask them, what does it mean to be a man to you? Is being a man different for you than it was for your father? Is there anything that you feel pressure to do or act and say? And it was just so incredible. And then the second thing that happened is I did a lot of research, and then I felt kind of betrayed by my own discipline, where I was like, okay, I've spent so much money educating myself when it comes to gender and when it comes to gender equality. Why didn't anyone tell me how much men benefit from all of this, right? Like, we know it's beneficial to women, but like, holy crap, men in feminist societies and gender equal societies live longer, right? Iceland is this perfect example of this feminist utopia. Just Google Iceland and women, and you'll find all these different examples of why women are better off in a country like Iceland that has the highest level of gender equality. But then I started researching how are the men doing? And, according to Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson, we would think that they would be doing horribly under a feminist dictatorship. And so I ended up going to Iceland and trying to save men from feminism and bring them back to America where they're safe. And none of them wanted to come to America, right? They were like, I love my parental leave. I love my healthcare. I love having more sex and living longer, right? So there's so many positive impacts from feminism that really benefit everybody, that we when we only talk about it in terms of women, we're actually limiting the conversation. So
I'll get real a bit. This is something I'm very, very passionate about, because my dad probably should have been a youth pastor. He was very involved in particularly men's ministry at my church growing up. And so I've seen the men's conferences, and frankly, my whole life have seen damaged men and sometimes their sons and how they pass that down, and what happens when they don't feel strong or they don't feel like they have a purpose. And then if you look at the numbers, who is causing the biggest problems to women?
And to men, by the way. He's causing problems to other men as well.
Oh, yeah, sure. Right? Yes. And actually in your book, you said there's no greater threat to humankind than our current definition of masculinity, which I think is saying the same thing. So why is our current definition of masculinity a threat? And I'll preface this by saying, I don't know how much I'm going to fundamentally agree with you. I'm really excited. I want to learn from you, because I think your perspective is frankly what men need here. So what did you mean when you said that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my first question is also like, how do we define weak men, right? And I think in our society, how we define weak men is often the ones that are strong, right? So a man who, for example, is with a group of men and there's a sexist joke or there's a racist joke or whatever it is, and he's like, hey, that's like not cool. He's going to be like, okay, he's going to be called a pussy. He's going to be called whatever, right? And he's going to be seen as non-masculine, when actually what takes bravery, what takes courage, what takes, being non-conventional is actually going against the grain of that sort of misogyny. So I think that's like an interesting tension there.
You're right. The premise of My Weak Men is actually should be up for debate, or like that premise needs to change a bit.
Well, but I think it's a good framing, right? So because too often, and this is how I'm going to answer your question and also touch on that, which is if we look at vaccines, for example, and the COVID pandemic and who's getting vaccines and who's not getting vaccines, we have seen now research throughout the pandemic showing that men are, less likely to wear masks. They're less likely to wash their hands. They're less likely to social distance. They're less likely to be in support of, states having lockdowns.
God, we're the worst.
Right? And rules. And so... But what's really interesting is that there's recent data that I wrote about from a column on MSNBC, which actually makes a difference of but which men, right? Because it's not all men, hashtag, right? And I'm using this in a positive feminist way, not the way that it's, often used to derail conversations around feminism, but it is in the study that they actually tried to make a difference between men and how they identify with their masculinity, right? And so they asked men, do you identify as very masculine, somewhat masculine, not masculine at all, or do you not care? And this is the fascinating bit. This is one of the cool, I had a nerd orgasm, when I read this, okay?
Okay.
What's so fascinating is that when we look at men who are hostile to the vaccine, men who've been gathering with groups of more than 10 people, it's the men who identify as very or completely masculine. When you look at men who don't, they are actually, you can't tell the difference between women and men. So it is not men's biological gender that determines their behavior. It is their relationship with their gender that determines their behavior and attitudes, right? And so to me, that's where it's that definition, right? Because we define masculinity in a certain way, and men who ascribe to that cultural definition, which is being pushed down their throats and being, rewarded on all kinds of ways in our cultural artifacts, in our political system, right? The men who ascribe to that end up being not just a danger to other people, but a danger to themselves, right? If you're not getting vaccinated, you're not wearing a mask. I mean, not only are you, is it disrespectful to other people, it's also putting you at risk. And this is not just one, this is one example. I cite many in the book about, from wearing a condom during sex, men who are more, again, identify with these more masculine, prototypically masculine characteristics, are less likely to practice safe sex. They're more likely to not respect traffic lights, right? Get into accidents. There's so many different ways that we see this play out. And so that's why I didn't say men are the greatest threat to our society. It's our definition of masculinity that's the greatest threat that we need to disrupt and encourage men to liberate themselves from.
This episode of Yang Speaks is brought to you by BetterHelp. I love BetterHelp. Oh my gosh. I do it once a week. My therapist, her fake name is Sarah, because I don't want to, I don't know, feels wrong, maybe tell her real name because it's supposed to be confidential with me. But anyway, it's amazing. I can go online, I register, I can do video, I can do chat, I can chat her anytime. It's awesome. You can start communicating. It's so fast, under 48 hours. It's not a crisis line. It's not self-help. It's just professional counseling done securely online. So you can talk to your counselor. I talk to Sarah all the time. It's fantastic. You can get it all over the world, and you get licensed professional counselors that match with you depending on what you're looking for, whether you're coping with depression or stress, anxiety, relationships, grief, self-esteem. For me, it's just I need help with figuring out the direction of the world, navigating what is going on out there. We try to do that on the pod, but BetterHelp is there too. I really, really can't stress enough how important it is to get your thoughts, emotions out there, to talk to somebody. It's great. So here's the deal. I want you to start living a happier life today. And as a listener of Yang Speaks, you'll get 10% off your first month by visiting our sponsor, betterhelp.com/Yang. Join over 1 million people who have taken charge of their mental health, like me and Andrew. We got this. That's betterhelp, HELP.com/Yang. That weakness, that lack of understanding that being a man is not just dominating a conversation or not looking at women as an object, and that sense of what it means to be a man is not to me, it has to be taught. And it comes to me down to the relationship probably with their father. Who was your model of masculinity and manhood as a child? And if you look at the numbers in the United States, where I think it's half of marriages end up in divorce right now. And it's 40% of kids are born to single parents, mostly single mothers, and they don't have a father figure, or they always pick one, and you never know what you're getting in that sense because you're a child and you're latching on. What have you seen in your data on the family structure driving weak and strong men, and let's call it weak and strong relationships with one's masculinity?
It's incredibly impactful. Obviously, look, we're all sort of little miniature versions of our childhood selves, just like playing adults, right? So our development in the first 5 years especially is extremely hard to deprogram, right? So whatever attention or neglect or abuse, right, you experience at that time or absence, right, will impact you. And what's really interesting is that we often frame girls as being the vulnerable gender, right? We often frame conversations around like protecting our children, like protecting our girls, right? From abuse, from pregnancy or teen pregnancy, right? We're very protective of girls. And we're not protective of boys. We actually often see that parents, and again, this is not, I think women and men do this, but I think men feel like it's their responsibility to discipline boys, right? And to make sure that they're not soft and that they're, that they can protect, not be protected. And what we find in the data that I find really important for us to talk about as a society is that in many ways, boys are actually more vulnerable than girls. When you look at, for example, certain areas that have less resources, where there's more poverty, right? Or in a school where there's literally, again, like a lower income neighborhood, or there's less resources in their particular educational opportunities. Boys and girls are hurt by, we see the data in the United States, how your zip code defines, so many other things. But for boys, it is worse. And girls will be able to adapt and fare better in low resource environments than boys are. This is not to say that girls don't need the same stuff, but boys, and one other piece of data that's, I think, really relevant and that relates to fatherhood is, the mass incarceration problem that we have in this country, where, Black and brown fathers are literally not allowed to parent. 91% of parents who are in jail currently are fathers. So the mass incarceration conversation is a fatherhood conversation. And so what we also find is that, again, having a parent who's incarcerated is extremely impactful in negative ways for children. Yep. But again, we see it for girls, but it is worse for boys in terms of their behavioral, sort of changes in the way that they will be less likely to finish school. So boys are actually really vulnerable, and boys, you need to be treated with the same level. We need to be just as curious about the way that we can protect boys as we are interested in protecting girls. And by the way, when we protect boys, it protects girls, because to your point, most of the problems that women have, are because of men. So it's like, let's just, men are the first victims of patriarchy. Like, they're victimized by it, and then they victimize women.
And that's not a classic male thing to think we're the victim in some.
You think you win in this system. But it's a pyramid scheme. Like, who wins? Like 1%. And then the rest don't. They just constantly try and climb up the ladder, but they're not able to achieve any of the rewards.
So one of the stats we would, Andrew and I would cite, it's in his book, The War on Normal People, his older book. But he would talk about what happens when men and women lose their jobs. And so the job, and particularly in older generations, the job was not just your job. It was your livelihood, your purpose. You are the provider, you're the man, you're the breadwinner, whatever to finish. But there's a lot of identity associated with it, particularly for men. And the numbers bear that out. When women lose their jobs, they generally stay, like, their behavior doesn't really change. They stay productive. They either become more caretakers in the home, or they join nonprofits, or they get involved in school, and they essentially stay flat in terms of their overall well-being and productivity. Men disintegrate. Men turn to, by the numbers, 50% video games, alcohol, sometimes drugs, and pornography. And
or suicide.
Yes. They get, and then they get depressed and so very, very serious mental health issues and suicide. How have you seen the element of strength play in? And I really want to dive in because there's also emotional strength too, which I think women are, based on what you're talking about, probably stronger emotionally than men. So there's two different types of strength here. How much that responsibility kind of weighs in on people's relationship with their gender, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, that's a really interesting question. Feminism and gender equality actually acts as a buffer for male suicide. Okay? Because what we find throughout history is exactly what you're saying. When there's economic crises, when a lot of people lose their jobs, and particularly COVID was the first actually extremely unequal recession in history where women were the most hurt. But if you look at 2008, for example, the last recession we had, men lost a lot of jobs, right? Women did too, but manufacturing jobs, right? Like when we think about the jobs that were really lost, a lot of men lost their jobs, right? And so what happens is normally you have an increase in male suicide, right? When you have higher unemployment with men because of everything that you've said. But when you have a society where women actually contribute equally, right? That it's not just men are the breadwinner and women stay at home, that women are the breadwinner too. Male and female suicide rates are not as skewed. And that's because, the thing you can infer from that, which the researcher who studied this inferred this, is, when you put all of that burden on one person and on one gender, and it's also on something that you cannot control. I mean, the both of us could lose our jobs tomorrow, right? This is not something that's, you earn, right? It's out of your control. But if the only thing that makes you a man is being a breadwinner, and that's no longer available to you, of course you're going to think that you're a burden. Of course you're going to think that there's nothing good that you can do. You're going to have a crisis of identity, and that's what we're seeing men experience. And again, it's like, if we could degender working, if we could degender breadwinning as an identity, and by doing that, give men more flexibility and possibility and imagination about how to be men in society and how to be useful, or, what their purpose can be. Like, then you have such an expansive opportunity, and you have men who aren't as, completely distraught and destroyed if they lose their jobs. And so I think so much about that, about how, these roles are made up. These roles are just like, again, we can go back into capitalism and all that stuff, but like literally, like these were just inventions. Like, women of color have always worked. Like it wasn't a thing. Like it was just like a white working class model, right, of the nuclear family that men work and women.
Norman Rockwell painting, whatever it is. Yeah,
exactly. And so if we were to sort of just give people more flexibility when it comes to that, it would just make everyone, much happier. And I get so sad, to think that a man would feel like a burden because, he's not able to provide. And also providing, women provide by doing all kinds of things, right? Like, even if we think about prototypical, like a stay-at-home dad or mom is providing. Oh my God. Like, that's providing care.
My mom was
that's
a
providing
mom. And she worked harder than my dad in many ways.
Exactly. It's just,
added more value to
work.
the community than my father did. And my dad, nothing against my dad. My dad's ministry, or, the church's ministry that I grew up in, or wherever he is, one of the things, like the most common things, we bring all these men together, which is great. And it would be called, my dad does one called Iron Sharpens Iron, which is a Bible verse, like show iron sharpens iron, and one man sharpens another, which I do think, like brotherhood and sisterhood, I think are really important particularly for men to actually talk about this stuff. But one of the things, like the most common thing we get at these, it's wild, is that the men say their wives nag them. She's nagging me. She's telling me to take the trash out, telling me I'm not doing this. And what my dad and the conference would say to the guys, and I want your opinion on whether this is healthy or counterproductive to what we're talking about here, because this is where I think the devil's in the details and stuff. What they would say at the church would be, well, what is she nagging you to do is what the question is. And she's like, well, she wants me to take the trash out. She wants me to make the bed. He's like, well, are you the man of the house? Like, yes. She's like, well, whose job is it to make sure the house is looking good? He's like, it's my job. Like, yes. So like, what is she nagging you to do, bud? She's nagging you to do your job. I'm like, thank God she's there, because it sounds like you wouldn't fucking do it. So when we tell men this, we being like the leaders of this, a light bulb goes off. And to me, I always felt like it was shifting their definition of masculinity, where I don't have to be like, yeah, rah, rah, you get that from me, But it's like, no, I'm actually here to help and support you and some protection, some love, some but it like a responsibility piece. Thoughts on that? Like, how off base is that church in Florida talking about that at the moment?
No, I think that's wonderful. and again, it's like, I think it's such a great way to frame this conversation, right? That again, I just want to degender shit. Like, I just want to degender, yeah, keeping your home clean. Like, that should just be something you do, period. Like not something that anyone has to, ask you to do because their gender is right. And you find this with LGBTQ couples. LGBTQ couples have really higher levels of satisfaction in their relationships than straight couples. Because
there's no norm. It's like, who fits?
Well, that's
if this
the thing.
Is what the man is supposed to do, and it's two women.
Yes, it's just like, what do you like to do? And it's our house, and how are we going to? There's just a more equitable separation of work, because there's not predetermined rules that are made up by who the fuck knows, and there's more freedom, right? It's all about freedom. Like, truly, it is about freedom. And with your example, the other thing I was just thinking about, which really again is such a detriment to our society, that we consistently are trained not to listen to women and not to believe women and to blame women. Like, we blame women for everything. And it is so, again, I mean, there's examples of, we blame women for their own sexual assault. Like, we blame women for, right, like not smiling enough.
Andrew talks about being dehuman, where you don't look at women as equal.
Exactly.
As a human.
It's a dehumanization.
That needs to be taught. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think because biologically, if you're just cavemen.
I don't think that boys are like that, though. Like, I don't think that there's something natural. Again, it comes back to the research separating, and I think we need more research that asks these nuanced questions, that instead of seeing men as a monolith, is interested in how they, what they believe about masculinity and how that ends up determining a lot of different things. Like I think we assume certain biological, we did this with women, right? We assumed women were just kinder and on their periods and more emotional. And it's like, these things are so wrong. Like, emotional. Do you want to talk about how, like, every war, like in history, like, and this is not to say again that women are more pacific, but we've create, our society creates certain rules, certain norms, certain scripts, and then we follow them. And then it's like, I want people to be interested in figuring out who they are authentically, right? And maybe it means that, you're a go-getter and you have more of an aggressive personality, right? In that way. And like, that's who you are. There are women who are like that. Like, it's fine. But is that really who you are? Or are you playing a part? And when it comes to, again, just listening to women, that's I think everyone wants something that, like, a marriage that doesn't end in divorce. Like, I think no one's like in it to like divorce, but the number one factor that leads to a lasting marriage, heterosexual marriage, is a man that accepts his wife's influence. Okay. And this is from the Gottman Institute. They've done years and years of research on this. And it's very simple, right? It just means when she says something, you listen. When she says something, you don't say, no, you're wrong, or, oh, you're making things up, like the way that we talked about women in our society.
The world is opening up again. We can go outside again. So whether you're working or playing, a lot of us can be on the move this summer. And my advice to you, take your Raycon earbuds with you. So a pair of Raycon wireless earbuds in your ears can make all the difference of what you're doing when we're finally getting outside this summer. You get crisp, powerful beats at half the price of all the other premium audio brands. They look great, they feel even better, and they come in a range of cool colors. So with customizable gel tips intended for a comfortable in-ear fit, and they're built to go wherever you go with a quick, seamless Bluetooth pairing and compact charging case. It's pretty freaking awesome. I can take them anywhere, throw them in my bag, throw them in a suitcase, throw them in the pocket. So this is the deal. Raycon's offering 15% off all their products for our listeners, and here's what you've got to do to get it. Go to buyraycon.com/yang. You'll get 15% off your entire Raycon order. It's an awesome deal. You'll want to grab a pair and a spare. That's 15% off. Buyraycon.com/yang. That's buyraycon.com/yang.
In teaching men to be an actual strong man, which actually requires them to be weaker in a lot of ways, weaker in terms of the traditional definition of masculinity, and women the same way, almost like to be a little more masculine in some ways in terms of being more assertive and more empowered and more confident. Can you go too far in one direction when you're trying to, like you're talking about, like flipping the script and redefining a lot of this stuff?
So first of all, yeah, Chinese medicine, Chinese philosophy, the yin and the yang is literally like the feminine and the masculine, right? That you need
perfectly yoked, equally yoked is the biblical version of that, yeah.
Exactly. And it's all about, you know, how we all have feminine and masculine energy and things have masculine and feminine energy, right? There's like all kinds of, and we've accepted that for women. And again, it's more for, you know, we accepted more with white women, with the more privileged you are, the more you can be like, you know, dress up like a man and no one cares. And it's not the same for, you know, different kinds of women. And again, you know, marginalization will play into that. But generally speaking, there's just a much more of an acceptance of women who that we accept that women can be masculine and feminine. I mean, we can wear pants, literally, like no one, you know, but you can't wear a dress. If you show up and you wear a dress, it's like, oh my God, like Harry Styles on the cover of Vogue. Like high heels were invented by men for men, right? Like
they were invented for men
in 1600 Persia. Like so that it was to get on your horse and ride your horse more easily. They were like, oh, if we put heels, and so men wore high heels, right? Like all of these things, like even like if you look at, you know, robes, right? And what did Jesus wore a dress, right? Like
Jesus was able to wear a dress all day long,
exactly.
Which is not sacrilegious, folks. It's
who cares?
The reality. He also wasn't white. Don't forget that.
Yeah, that too. That's a big one.
That combo.
But men showing any kind of feminine energy is seen as taking away from their masculinity, right? It's seen as like, well, if you have feminine energy, then you can't be masculine. Whereas like women can wear pants and still be considered feminine. So it's about, you know, and that comes from misogyny, right? That comes from the feminine being the worst thing that a man can be, because a woman is the worst thing that you can, you know, is at the lowest ranking position. And so if we celebrate femininity, if we celebrate women, then we wouldn't be as afraid of men showing characteristics of women. We'd be like, look up to women. Look how great they are. You can be like them, right? In the way that we do that with girls, right? That they can be bosses and badasses and engineers and take on these masculine role, quote unquote, masculine roles and sort of responsibilities. We should, if we didn't hate women, right? If we didn't diminish the feminine, then it would be fine for men to show it.
Carly, a girlfriend, calls it the soft bigotry of low expectations, where I always see it, it's like the silent killer, where it's like no one in Wall Street is going on and be like, screw you, screw the women, right? No one's saying that. They're just silent. I've realized, particularly in Wall Street, like looking back, was like the young, ambitious, talented women that were coming in. And like, look, I've been there 5-6 years and they're right out of college. Like that's like the age gap. They would ask like, hey, do you, you've been a mentor to me, Zach, but also would like to find a female mentor here at the company, of course. And there weren't many to pick from. There was just a handful. And I'm curious about this application in the workplace. And like, look, I think a number of women will leave to have children. And I love that. And I think we should have workplaces that are more flexible to not separate church and state. In that sense, they shouldn't be mutually exclusive. But curious on like how this plays out in the real world. Right, in your eyes, because I've seen it, and it's just like this. It's like unspoken expectation that the women that do well here have to act like the dudes, and that's the culture.
And again, it comes back to, you know, because we devalue the feminine. In order for women to be successful, they have to be masculine, right? Or they have to take on these masculine characteristics and erase their femininity. And again, it comes from this made up thing where like masculinity is better. And it's like, why?
And women are so much better than men in so many things. And we all know it. We don't have to pretend. Yeah. It's not like we have to dig up some studies that are ambiguous. It's obvious, right?
And, and workplaces are better when everyone's at the table. Like even when we talk about, for example, I mean, we know having women in your boardroom, having women having a seat at the table, it just means that you make better decisions. There's more creativity, there's higher productivity, and there's a higher bottom line. But even if you look at, disability, the fact that we totally discriminate against people with disabilities in our society means that they're just completely erased from most workplaces and industries. But what we find is that there was a Accenture study actually that found that workplaces that did take a commitment to include disability into their diversity initiatives and programs had a higher bottom line. And there's kinds of
it makes sense from a profit perspective. Like more like different views, more diverse views, make better company.
That's the thing. And you'll serve more people. Like a quarter of the population is disabled. If you have no people with disabilities in the room, like you there's shit you could sell to them. Like, there's a capitalistic, obviously, argument here.
Yeah, but the pure asshole capitalist in me says you should probably have more women at the table.
Yeah, it's just like everyone wins. Yeah. I think again, it's like, it's not about telling men to act more like women. It's not about telling women to act more like men. It's just like letting everyone be who the fuck they want to be. Right. And like letting our children become who they are. And like, instead of this version, right, that they think that they're supposed to be. That's just I think we talk so much about the missed potential of women, right? And like, what if the girl that could have come up with the cure for cancer, had not been pushed to go into STEM. And I'm like, well, what if the boy who, would be this incredible nurse that could, heal all these people didn't go into nursing because his dad was like, that's not a real job for you. You have to do something else. Or teachers, right? Like the impact on Black boys in our country of just having a Black male teacher, and it's only 2% of teachers are Black men. So we're seeing, coming back to education, it's so important and could have such huge ripple effects if everyone could just fulfill their potential as humans instead of as men or women.
So I've learned gender is complicated. And I grew up learning gender was simple, right? So this has been a learning journey for me. Both myself, like understanding I don't have to be that type of man, right? But also learning about a whole number of, frankly, other journeys. When a child is starting to identify as a gender that's different than their biological gender, right? Like starting to identify differently. As a parent, what's a good best practice in terms of helping kids be themselves and like letting this education flourish in a new kind of world you're talking about? Yeah,
I mean, that's a really, really important question, especially as we're seeing, 2020 was the worst year with the most amount of anti-trans bills in ever. Children who are questioning their gender identity, the biggest threat to their lives is suicide. Okay. Right. Because they're already being told by everybody, right, that there's something wrong with them. And they're being excluded in a wide variety of ways. And it's the inner turmoil of having to figure that out is already humongous, right? And we know that trans kids, more than half of them have thought about suicide. And I just don't know if people realize how harrowing that statistic is. And we know that the people who are at the front lines of fighting these bills are saying, they're getting calls from kids saying, I'm going to kill myself. So the most important thing for children, and one last bit of data, is that actually, so there's, different things you can do before you're 18. And I understand these are children and, there are, concerns about making sure that they're okay. But actually, it's called hormonal suppression therapy. So it just means that we are suppressing their puberty. It doesn't mean that we're changing anything. It doesn't mean that we're making permanent changes, but just the fact of suppressing puberty reduces suicide ideation just across the board for these children. So we know based on the data, right, that what actually makes these children's lives really hard is not the fact that they're, trans or that they're gender non-binary. It is the way that society is imposing, certain rigidities or laws against them. And so the best thing that we can do, I think, as parents is try and protect our children, right? And the rest of the world is going to eat them up, right? Like no matter, literally, like I tell this to my parents, and I'm cisgender. When my parents are very critical, I'm like, the whole world is going to find problems with this book. Like, I don't need you to tell me what's wrong with me. I actually need you to tell me what's right with me. And so that would be my advice for parents who are dealing with this. And obviously, I'm not an expert on this, but and there's so many amazing, I'm thinking of Chase Strangio and Alok and Thomas Page McBee, like, trans voices who are really like Raquel Willis, who are leading the charge with this and I think are helping. But it's really about education, and educating parents to understand that this is not the end of the world. And, this can be something that you figure out privately. And the government should certainly not have any role in determining, these very private and personal decisions for people.
Correct me if I'm wrong. It seems like the future of this is how parents relate this and model this for their kids. And if that's broken, we're every problem we solve, we're just going to have 10x more problems on the other side of this. What do you think?
Yeah. And the more we let bills like this go by and we don't stand up against them, then parents do think that it's in their best interest to protect their children by denying their gender identity, right? Like it just reminds me of, like, again, coming back to disability, like the problem often is not the disability, it's the ableism, right? Like a person in a wheelchair is the barrier is not their wheelchair, it's the fact that, like, the Oscars, right, until this year didn't have a ramp. And it's like, just make better design, right? Let's build a better society instead of confining our children to fit into it. And I also think, for parents who are listening, even if you're cisgender, like, if they're going to start pulling data on children's genitals, like they're gonna come for you next. Like, if we allow, this is a privacy issue. Like the fact that they're want to have all this surveillance of our literal private parts should scare everybody who cares about privacy. Like, that's weird.
Oh, very, very weird. Well, I think what breaks my heart is, like, on these issues, when they get political, we have essentially billions of dollars of ads in messaging campaigns dividing us on them, but putting people one way or other, when the root problem is, like, we don't have a very good public education system in this country where, like, teachers are well paid and happy and less stressed and can love their kids and have the bandwidth to treat them all differently, right? And individually. We don't have an infrastructure or, like, the economy, like the things that are actually probably driving some of this, these changes or negative behavior, like the root problems don't get addressed. And then we focus on these, let's call it quote unquote symptoms, right, of these culture wars. And it's heartbreaking that we have these conversations. But I think, frankly, Liz, someone like you, what you're doing to me is massively important. I think it's one of my passions in life is to figure out how we empower a new generation of men to treat women well, to believe that, to not be insecure when they're kicking your ass at something, to say, like, that's freaking awesome because I'm great at other things. And my manhood and my pride is not hurt or defined by the success of my wife or my sister or the women in my life. And to still feel strong when women are strong. That is, like, there's been this, like, if you're strong, then I have to be the weak one. I'm the, and I hope and I pray, and I'm grateful for people like you. Just, like, all it takes is just, we got to keep changing the conversation. Just keep talking about it. I'm so grateful when you come on. I honestly, like, I could talk about it 3 hours about this.
Me too. It's so great to see you. And I loved your stories. I think it's really useful to have. My biggest fear is that this conversation stays in the bubble, right? And I think it's really important to think about the language that we're using and how accessible it is accessibility is not just in terms of ramps, but even accessibility in terms of people who are different, differently educated, differently, who are in different jobs and different experiences and life perspectives. So I appreciate that. And I think the work you're doing is really important in creating that bridge.
Thank you. For the Love of Men is on sale, but we'll put the link in our bio, guys. And frankly, you can follow Liz Plank anywhere, TikTok, all those things. It's wonderful. Yeah. Thank you for joining. Go keep kicking butt.
Thank you. This is great.